1961, the United States Air Force sent medium assault transports known as the C-123 Provider to South Vietnam for use as cargo aircraft, but also spraying Agent Orange. These aircraft were used to spray Agent Orange, also known as herbicide orange, between 1961 and 1971. In 1972, these aircraft were assigned to various units within the United States for normal transportation and aeromedical evacuation missions. They flew with these units until 1982, at which point they were retired as surplus and obsolete to the desert boneyard maintained by the Air Force at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, Arizona. The employees at the base categorized them quickly as Agent Orange contaminated and were concerned about their safeties and filed Inspector General complaint with the United States Air Force. They were at that point ordered to wear special hazmat clothing to protect them from contamination by ingestion, inhalation, or dermal contact with the dioxin that contaminated the aircraft. Now, everyone in the Air Force realized they had toxic aircraft on their hands. Air Force Material Command, Air Force Surgeon General's Office, the Air Staff all agreed the aircraft were contaminated. But the question was, because survey after survey continued to prove them contaminated, beginning with the Conway test in 1979, the Porter-Weissman test in 1994, and subsequent tests out at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, all the aircraft were contaminated. And yet, by accident, 2 aircraft have been sold to Walt Disney for making films like Con Air. Very embarrassing. And because of that, in 1996, the Air Force Office of Environmental Law directed all information about the toxic aircraft be held in official channels only, where it rested secretly out of sight for many years. This was especially because some toxic aircraft have been sold to South Korea and Thailand, and this greatly concerned the State Department. So at the point of 1998, the aircraft question became really, what shall we do with them? Well, the Air Force sought out the advice of Dr. Al Young, the DoD agent consultant, and Dr. Young recommended destruction of the aircraft. That was the way to get rid of them, because they couldn't be sold, they couldn't be used as landfill, they had to be destroyed. Young recommended that the aircraft be destroyed, especially because the veterans who had flown them in 1972 to 1982 might learn of the contamination, come to conclude that they'd been exposed, and seek veterans' benefits for this Agent Orange exposure. Young wanted the Air Force to prevent that from happening. And indeed, the Air Force repeated Young's caution about the veterans by recommending to their superiors up to the air staff that the aircraft be destroyed, and with a significant part of that justification being to prevent the veterans who had already been exposed from learning of the contamination and seeking veterans' benefits. And Young was especially with these air transport crew members whom he spoke of so sarcastically. Then Young, this DoD official with the authority to recommend destruction of entire fleets of aircraft, for some reason in an email felt entitled to refer to veterans who flew these aircraft as trash haulers, freeloaders looking for a tax-free dollar from a sympathetic congressman. His contempt was unmasked. Young also helped the Air Force work on the publicity campaign to hide the destruction of the aircraft. He recommended directly that publicity be minimized and that a press release be prepared just in case there is an inquiry from the media. And he also worked with the Air Force to eliminate worrisome words like dioxin and Agent Orange. But the question did continue to be, how can the aircraft be destroyed? They were too toxic for landfill, too toxic for resale, too toxic to burn. They had to be destroyed. Well, fortunately, a Navy contract was located that allowed the aircraft to be destroyed for a cost of $1,000 each. This approach was approved by the Air Staff and was implemented in 2010, when all of the remaining toxic aircraft, whose saga began in 1961, were finally destroyed. After the major components of each aircraft were torn apart by heavy equipment, they were then gathered by forklift and other heavy movers to be placed onto flatbed trucks. They were taken to various locations on the base for more complete destruction, especially heavier items such as the engines. Once all the components had been busted up as much as possible, they were then re-shredded into strips of metal smaller than a cell phone, then shredded again to make sure it was completely destroyed. Finally, in a terribly macabre ceremony, the shredded metal was trucked to Wisconsin, where it was smelted, gathered by employees into ingot-forming molds, and they didn't even know that in the smelting process they were making even more dioxin for the environment. Each of the airplanes was smelted, poured into a mold, and the employees gathered them into ingots for a new car or airplane. So now, except for a few aircraft left in museums such as Patches at the Air Force Museum or the C-123 at the Pima Air Museum in Arizona, the C-123 has gone on to history. But what is not history yet is the fact that C-123 veterans who flew these aircraft remain concerned about their Agent Orange exposure. Their decade of flying the C-123 absolutely subjected them to inhalation, ingestion, and dermal routes of exposure. The veterans' exposure has been confirmed by the National Institutes of Health, the Environmental Protection Agency, the CDC Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, the United States Public Health Service, the University of Texas School of Medicine, Oregon Health Sciences University, and so many more experts throughout the world. So where does that leave us in the spring of 2013? Well, it leaves us with 1,500 to 2,500 veterans and their families, or their survivors, who have been denied veterans benefits by the Veterans Administration, which claims that they weren't actually exposed. That's right, the aircraft were contaminated, there's no question there, but the VA contends that that kind of contamination, which they describe as dry dioxin, does not lend itself readily to exposure to people aboard the airplane. This is contested by many scientists who believe that there was ingestion, inhalation exposure, as well as dermal exposure throughout the airplane, which tested heavily contaminated by Air Force toxicologists from 1979 on to the date of its destruction in 2010. But the problem is the VA is concerned about their budget, and they're concerned about inviting too many veterans to receive medical care for their illnesses, and thus they have decided that C-123 veterans were not exposed, in quotes, enough. And they also propose that the veterans have not been able to qualify under the law, even though the law provides that all veterans exposed to Agent Orange will be treated just like veterans who had Vietnam War experience, which means boots on the ground equals full medical care for Agent Orange presumptive illnesses for Vietnam War vets, as well as for C-123 veterans if the VA were to adopt this perspective. And what is this perspective which we demand of the VA? Very simple. Follow the law. So if you're a C-123 veteran, what can you do? Very simple. Call the Agent Orange Registry at the VA and sign up. They'll provide a very complete physical. This will identify potential problems and add your information to that large body of information concerning Agent Orange issues. Second, watch your PSA numbers. Third, watch the fat intake because dioxin travels in the normal food chain in fats. If you're a family member or a concerned citizen, there is an awful lot you can do, and it begins with calling your senator and congressman and demand that they work closely with Senator Burr and his staff Senator Burr is the ranking member of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee and has taken the lead on this issue. It is bicameral and bipartisan. They invite all concerned legislators and their staffs to coordinate efforts with Mr. Brooks Tucker of Senator Burr's staff. Please do this. Please help us out as best you can by being active, at least on the telephone and with a letter to the authorities in Washington.